Voices in the Trench, July 12, 1944, Caen, Normandy, France. By the second week of July 1944, the city of Caen was in ruins. Once a quiet medieval town in Normandy, it had become one of the most bitterly contested targets in the Allied campaign following D-Day. British and Canadian forces had been trying to take the city since June 6. German defenders, dug deep into fortified positions, had orders to hold it at all costs. On the morning of July 12, as the artillery smoke cleared and the church steeples stood broken against the pale sky, a British infantry section of the 2nd Battalion, Royal Warwickshire Regiment, found themselves entrenched near the northern sector of the city. The sounds of war had not stopped for weeks, only changed. Machine gun bursts came in shorter intervals. Mortar fire fell further away. But the tension in the trench had never eased. That morning, a war correspondent embedded with the unit began recording voices, not for radio, not for propaganda, but for documentation. The soldiers were not aware their conversations were being captured in full. The tape that survived gives us a rare, uninterrupted audio record of what men spoke about when the fighting paused just long enough to let them speak. The voices are calm. One man speaks of his brother who landed in Italy. Another mentions a letter from home. They argue about tea. One tells a joke that falls flat. The youngest soldier, a 19-year-old from Liverpool, sings a line of a song before going quiet. Then the sound of incoming shells returns. The recording ends not with an explosion, but with the click of the stop button. That tape, later archived by the British War Office, became known unofficially as the Caen Voices. What it captured was not a battle, but a moment of stillness inside it. This is the story of those voices, and the silence that came after. After the success of the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, the Allies pushed inland with the goal of liberating key cities in Normandy. Among them, Caen was considered vital. It sat near the Orne River and served as a key road and rail junction. Taking Caen would allow the Allies to break out toward Falaise and eventually Paris. But the Germans knew this too. Hitler had ordered Field Marshal Rommel to hold Caen at all costs. For the men on both sides, this meant weeks of intense urban fighting, artillery bombardments, and endless days in shallow foxholes and muddy trenches. British and Canadian forces of the Second Army launched multiple operations, Perch, Epsom, and finally Charnwood, to seize the city. By early July, most of northern Caen lay in Allied hands, but the southern portion remained contested. German SS Panzer divisions, particularly the 12th SS Hitlerjugend and 21st Panzer, were dug in with tanks, snipers, and fortified machine gun nests. The city, once known for its cathedrals and cobbled streets, was now reduced to rubble, with civilian casualties mounting by the thousands. Among the units advancing into the northern sector of Caen was the British 2nd Battalion, Royal Warwickshire Regiment. Their role was to secure the eastern flank and prevent German counterattacks along the Orne. On July 12, the battalion held a temporary forward trench near a collapsed church. That day, heavy artillery had been called off for several hours to allow for repositioning. The lull created one of the rare quiet intervals during the Battle of Caen. It was during this window that a British war correspondent, Corporal David Kelshaw, sat with a group of frontline soldiers. He had been carrying a small magnetic wire recorder, a new piece of equipment designed to capture battlefield audio. Kelshaw began recording casual conversation among the men, none of whom had been instructed to speak formally. His job had not been to gather propaganda, but to observe morale. The men's voices reflect exhaustion, sarcasm, and ordinary frustration. One voice jokes that he's been in the same pair of socks since Bayeux. Another asks if someone's got real tea or the bloody army packet. Some of them share updates from letters, and one briefly mentions watching a German officer shot while trying to escape. They talk, argue, and occasionally fall silent. But what makes the recording unique is its lack of drama. It sounds like men waiting, not for orders, but for the next noise to come from beyond the trench wall. This audio, later recovered and archived by the BBC and the British War Office, offers one of the clearest glimpses into the mental state of infantry troops during a major offensive. It reveals not what they fought for, but what they thought about in the moments between violence. The original recording was only 13 minutes long. It was made on a magnetic wire spool, marked with a red grease pencil, the 12th of July, Caen, 2nd Warwicks. For years, it remained in a steel box, mislabeled as raw signal traffic, until a BBC researcher rediscovered it in the late 1960s while archiving forgotten materials from the Second World War. What the tape revealed was startling in its simplicity. There was no speech or narration, no officer's briefing, no sound of combat, only the ambient life inside a trench on the northern edge of Caen. The war correspondent, Corporal David Kelshaw, had simply set the device down and let it run. The voices belonged to 6 men, identified later through cross-referenced war diaries and unit rosters. Private Alec Morin, Lance Corporal James Fairley, Sergeant Tom Bennett, Private Darren Wicks, and 2 others, whose names remain uncertain. Their conversations, preserved in unedited form, offer one of the rarest acoustic artifacts of the war, not a scripted interview or broadcast, but real voices, in real time. Private Morin can be heard describing a stray dog they had been feeding for days. Sergeant Bennett shares a bitter laugh over the tea ration, calling it muddy dishwater with hopes. Someone asks if the Canadians on the left flank have pushed yet, and another replies that they heard tanks last night. A moment of quiet passes, broken by someone humming a line from a popular 1930s tune. They joke about biscuits. They swear at the mud. One man laughs hard, then coughs, then says nothing more. What's most notable is not what's said, but what isn't. There's no mention of death. No talk of tactics. No bravado. The tape captures the emotional flattening of men who have been at war too long to romanticize it. Their tone is calm but drained, like a machine running on reserve. One moment stands out near the end. Private Wicks, the youngest, asks if anyone wants to write a message to stick in the ground in case they don't make it back. Nobody answers. The silence is long. Then someone mutters, "No one's reading it if we're gone." Laughter follows, but it sounds forced. Moments later, the hum of distant artillery builds in the background. The voices begin to fade. The magnetic wire runs out with an audible snap. That was the last known sound captured from that position before it came under German mortar fire later that afternoon. According to official reports, 2 of the men on the tape were killed within 48 hours. The rest advanced with the unit into the southern outskirts of Caen. The recorder was damaged in the shelling, but the spool survived, salvaged and sent back to England with the wounded correspondent. By the afternoon of July 12, the lull in fighting around Caen ended. At 14:15 hours, German mortar teams from the 21st Panzer Division began shelling forward British positions near the eastern trench lines, including the area where the recording had taken place. The men who had spoken casually that morning were now fully exposed to renewed enemy fire. According to the 2nd Battalion War Diary, the German bombardment was not sustained, but came in short, intense waves targeting supply routes and infantry staging zones. The section holding the trench, marked as grid reference 222-89, was pinned for nearly an hour without reinforcement. Communications were down. The battalion's radio man had been wounded earlier in the day, and runners were the only option for relaying messages. It was during this window that Sergeant Tom Bennett took command of a small flanking position east of the trench. A German milligram 42 had opened fire from the corner of a collapsed farmhouse and was suppressing movement. Bennett led a 3-man fire team to a forward ditch, using smoke shells as cover. One of those men, Private Darren Wicks, the same voice heard on the recording, was hit by shrapnel while crossing the open ground. He died before reaching the ditch. Despite the loss, Bennett's team managed to disable the machine gun nest using a PIAT launcher scavenged from another squad. For this action, he was later awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal, though records show he never formally accepted the ceremony. The same day, a counterattack was launched by the 12th SS Panzer, forcing the British line to hold under sustained pressure. The trench, battered and partially collapsed, was finally abandoned by nightfall as the unit was ordered to reposition south. The remaining soldiers, including those whose voices were captured, moved to reinforce a new sector near the Caen Ring Road. It was the last time that particular position was occupied by British forces. The recording device, damaged by shrapnel, was recovered from a buried kit bag the next day by Corporal David Kelshaw, who had suffered minor injuries during the barrage. He wrapped the magnetic wire spool in oilcloth and turned it over to a field courier bound for Bayeux. Kelshaw would later lose his right hand in August during the push toward Falaise. He never made another recording. In post-war interviews, he described that single reel as the most honest thing I ever captured. No screams. No speeches. Just lads waiting to be told to move. The turning point at Caen was not marked by a decisive victory or defeat. It was defined by what men did in the narrowest cracks of calm, how they coped, how they moved, and how they went silent just before the world changed again. By July 19, 1944, Caen was officially declared secured. The battle had raged for over a month. Entire districts were flattened by Allied bombing and German artillery. Civilian casualties numbered in the thousands, and the German forces had been pushed back across the Orne River. The Allies now held one of the most strategically important cities in Normandy, but at a cost measured in rubble, fire, and lives. For the 2nd Battalion, Royal Warwickshire Regiment, the casualty list from July 12 alone included 7 dead and 16 wounded. Among them were 2 men heard on the trench recording, Private Darren Wicks, confirmed killed in action, and Lance Corporal James Fairley, wounded by mortar fragments but later returned to duty. The other survived the Caen engagement and advanced deeper into France in the weeks that followed. The trench where the recording took place was never reused. It collapsed completely during later shelling and was eventually paved over during post-war reconstruction. Today, a residential block stands above the same ground, with no physical marker to indicate what once happened beneath it. The magnetic wire recording survived its journey back to England. For decades, it remained archived and unheard, deemed unremarkable due to its lack of strategic content. But in the 1970s, during a BBC effort to collect personal testimonies from World War II veterans, the reel was rediscovered by historian Margaret Linney. She played the tape and recognized its value instantly, not as a military artifact, but as a piece of human preservation. The BBC aired a segment of the recording in 1973 under the title Voices from the Trench, as part of a radio program on the Normandy campaign. The public response was immediate. Veterans wrote in to identify voices. Families of the deceased reached out, hearing for the first time the laughter, curses, and quiet thoughts of sons and brothers long gone. The tape was later restored, digitized, and added to the Imperial War Museum's permanent audio archive. Today, it is studied by historians, psychologists, and students, not for what it tells us about Operation Charnwood, but for what it reveals about human endurance in war. The aftermath of Caen was not only a military reorganization or the counting of dead. It was also the beginning of reflection, of veterans trying to make sense of what they had lived through and what they had lost. The recording captured a fragment of that process while it was still unfolding. No speeches. No patriotic slogans. Just the quiet, unscripted sound of waiting men. In the long shadow of Caen's destruction, the most enduring memory is not the advance, but the silence that came before it. In the decades that followed the war, few of the surviving soldiers from the Caen trenches spoke in detail about that July day. Some returned to civilian life quietly. Others continued serving across Europe and into the post-war years. But the recording, those 13 minutes of casual speech, remained the only living testimony from that exact trench, on that exact day. What made it significant was not the combat. It was the humanity. The way men passed time in limbo, speaking about nothing of military value, just food, family, weather, and old jokes. The same things they might have said in a factory, on a farm, or at a pub. The tape revealed that even in a war as brutal and mechanized as the Second World War, the human experience in its quietest form endured. In 1994, on the 50th anniversary of the Battle of Caen, the Imperial War Museum released the full recording to the public for the first time. A short documentary titled 13 Minutes of Silence was produced to accompany it. It played across British television and was later broadcast in Canada, France, and Australia. By that time, only 2 of the men featured on the recording were still alive. One of them, Sergeant Tom Bennett, declined to be interviewed but sent a written statement. He wrote, "We didn't think it would last. That moment. That silence. We thought it would be gone in the next round. Funny what sticks. We just talked, and somehow that's the part the world kept." The site of the trench is now part of a residential neighborhood in modern Caen. There is no monument. But in 2016, a local historian succeeded in placing a small brass plaque on the side of a nearby building. It reads simply, "Here, men waited. Here, voices were recorded.